no está encendido. Que no está encendido. Eso sí. ¿Oye todo?
No. Está grabando, pero esto lo graba todo. Está automáticamente encendido. Después va a tener Javier.
Es una confidencia, ¿no?
El microespía.
Si decimos algo de Javier ya,
Yeah, water here.
Estamos hablando fatal de
dueño de la
Welcome back. Nice to see that at least some of you have survived this far. So we're going to start with keynote with Dr. Fair in a minute. But before we continue, I have to make a little announcement in Spanish. Some people wanted to have more translations, so I'll make a little comment about that. Algunos creo que queréis más traducciones durante los talleres. Hay personas que a lo mejor no tienen tanto nivel de inglés. Recuerda un poco que el idioma oficial del curso es inglés, y bueno, se ha hecho un esfuerzo porque los materiales estén en castellano. Tenéis la presentación ahí. Y invito a los que prefieren seguir la presentación en castellano que os sentéis más cerca, ¿no? Y veo que hay sitios vacíos por aquí para poder ver la presentación en español. Durante las sesiones de tarde de los talleres, lo que sí está disponible es siempre una persona que puede traducir, ¿no? Por ejemplo, la sesión que van a impartir Celia, Virginia y Corina, pues las tres hablan español, ¿no? Entonces ellas van a impartir la sesión en inglés, pero en cualquier momento, y sobre todo cuando haya alguna actividad práctica, la pueden traducir, ¿no? De la manera que si alguien quiere que se le repita algo en español, pues con total libertad, por favor, solicitarlo. Las conferencias es un poco más difícil, solo tenemos los materiales en castellano, ¿de acuerdo? Quería hacer esa clarificación. Y con eso os dejo con Ricardo Pellón, que va a introducir al doctor Pérez. Gracias.
Hello. I'm going to have a brief presentation of Professor Holth. It's been my pleasure to introduce him. He's associate professor at the Kansas University, Oslo University, and he has a varied training. He studies psychology and philosophy, and he has been involved in experimental research, but also a lot of work in the applied field. So his area of expertise basically is stimulus control, especially on derived stimulus relations and this sort of knowledge derived from that work. So he's going to present us some of that on the exemplar training related to stimulus control, and thanks for accepting the invitation. Welcome.
Thanks a lot, Ricardo, and thank you for being here. I didn't expect to see so many people at this time of the day. It's nice to see you. I've been led into this field about multiple exemplar training because I think it has been misused a lot lately in behavioral analysis, and it sort of has become the explanation for almost every complex thing that comes out of different types of training. There doesn't seem to be any limit at all to what can be obtained by simple multiple exemplar training, and I think that's wrong, and we need to look into these details a lot more. I'll skip the abstract here and go straight to the overview of what I'm going to talk about. First, a little bit about the background for multiple exemplar training, the basic logic of it. What do we think we can obtain through multiple exemplar training? A little bit about the history of the term. Multiple exemplar training as an explanation for complex behavior. What are the limits? Do we actually do analysis when we use multiple exemplar training, or do we sometimes just use what has been called a bag of tricks without much analysis at all? I think a lot more analysis is needed, maybe even synthesis, but at least some analysis to start with of what can be obtained by multiple exemplar training. And we often hear colleagues say that it's an empirical question. It's an empirical question. You can always say that it's an empirical question, but at some point we should be able to do more than that. There must be some principles that allow us to predict what kind of result we can get out of different types of training, and not just that we have to start from scratch every time we have a new question. So it's too simple, I think, to say that everything is just an empirical question. At some point we need to be able to say more. What is an exemplar, after all? What makes an exemplar different from a non-exemplar? We'll just briefly look at one particular example, the example of imitation, and perhaps different classes of imitation. Optimal training, diversity or number of exemplars. How can we use multiple exemplar training most effectively? And are there some principal limits to what can be trained by multiple exemplars? I think we need to ask that question and look at also at different types of trainings that obviously do require multiple exemplar training. Then first, a little bit about the background here. Bear, 1981, has this quote here: "The most common mistake that teachers make," he said, when they want to establish a generalized behavior change, is to teach one good example of it and expect the student to generalize from that example. So that sort of sets the stage and describes situations in which multiple exemplar training is needed. Stokes and Bear, 1977, said that an implicit technology, that was the title of their paper, an implicit technology of generalization. They described several training techniques specifically aimed at the programming of generalization, including what they call train and hope. So they just train an exemplar, maybe train a couple of exemplars, and hope that it generalizes throughout the different skills that are needed to be established. And sometimes, of course, that succeeds. Sometimes a few exemplars to just shoot wildly and get a few exemplars, and it works. So sometimes that kind of successful generalization occurs without any additional effort to teach or to hit all those different specific different classes that need to be directly taught in order to have the full generalization of the skill. Logos, 1981, that would be the me book, I think. So the basic rule about stimulus generalization is that if you don't get it, build it, which essentially boils down to multiple exemplar training. Stokes and Bear had mentioned different techniques in addition to train and hope, such as sequential modification, and the strategy to teach sufficient exemplars. And of course, the logic behind multiple exemplar training is very simple. We can see this from the early studies in the 40s and 50s and 60s on peaks and peak shifts. Here we have a positive stimulus here, stimulus in the presence of which reinforcement is contingent upon a response, and another S plus here, and we see the rate of responding in the presence of those two particular positive SDs is very high, and we get some lower rates on the sides of that. And if you use a particular negative SD, you get this drop here and a peak shift away from there. So instead, by using more different positive SDs, the idea is to get the level up all the way within the limits of what constitutes a specific stimulus class in the presence of which we want responding to occur. So it's just a question of using a sufficient number of S pluses to get the whole level up to where we want it to be. Now, regarding the term itself, multiple exemplar training, it's not that old. It seems it has been around always, and it has since 1885 or 87, where there were a few dissertation abstracts that started to use the term multiple exemplar training. And the first published study was actually in 1989, concerned with multiple exemplar training of self-instruction by use and rush at that time. But of course, the idea, the principle of multiple exemplar training must have been widespread long before that, probably as long as there has been teaching going on. So we can look back through the history of psychology. For example, this is from Thorndike in 1911, where he described his experiments with problem cages and the cats who could do different things, turn a wheel, press a lever, and many different types of topographies which would open the door so the cats could get out of there and get fed. As Thorndike said, previous experience makes a difference in the quickness with which the cat forms the association, which means how quick the cat learns to get out of, to do whatever is needed to get out of the box. After getting out of 6 or 8 boxes by different sorts of acts, the cat's general tendency to claw at loose objects within the box is strengthened, and its tendency to squeeze through holes and bite bars is weakened. Accordingly, it will learn associations along the general line of the old more quickly. So that's the result of multiple exemplar training, that the cat gets better and better at finding out whatever's necessary to do to produce that consequence, you might say in colloquial terms. Other examples throughout the history of psychology are from Holth, 1920. Bernstein, Loveland, Cable did these experiments on concept learning in pigeons that actually responded differentially to pictures with humans in them. Many different pictures with and without humans, and the differential reinforcement made the pigeons able to discriminate between pictures that included humans and those that did not, and pictures that included trees and pictures that did not, for example. So that's kind of multiple exemplar training, also way before that term was used. Logos used multiple exemplar training to teach many different generalized skills in all of that work that led to the ebook and other publications. So there's no question it's been around. It's important. It does work in many cases, but its function has been oversimplified, and we need to get to the details of how it might work, I think. One particular area in which the role of multiple exemplar training has perhaps been overstated is, I think, within what's called relational frame theory, because multiple exemplar training there seems to be the solution to almost every complex how every complex phenomenon is established. And I think we need to be careful about just having multiple exemplar training as a kind of a trick, and not looking into the details of how it might work and do the necessary analysis. Skinner talked about this a long time ago. The cataloging of functional relationships isn't enough. These are the basic facts of a science, but the accumulation of facts is not science itself. Behavior can only be satisfactorily understood by going beyond the facts themselves. What is needed is a theory of behavior, and that's pretty interesting for a guy who is thought to be anti-theoretical in every way. And wrote the paper on our theories of learning necessary and concluded and answered no, but he was talking about specific kinds of theory, of course. Then we need to ask some questions. How is an exemplar defined? What is the optimal combination of sufficient exemplars and sufficient diversity to yield the most valuable generalization? Stokes and Baer asked this question back in '77. And what are the limits to what can be established through multiple exemplar training? Because there are some very clear limits here. First, regarding what is an exemplar? How can we define an exemplar? How can we distinguish between different exemplars? I think the closest, the best lead to that is in an article by Charlie Catania from 1973, actually, where he discussed the concept of the operand at that time and made this distinction between what's called a descriptive class and what's called a functional class, and show that a correspondence between those two classes is necessary to talk about operant behavior and an operant class at all. I try to explain what is meant by this by looking at the case of a discriminated operand, where a response occurs in the presence of a stimulus and is reinforced in that presence of the stimulus. Say in the beginning, we may have stimuli along some dimension. Just to make it simple, we'll talk about the dimension from left to right here, and we may have almost as much behavior going on when the stimulus is on this side of the dimension as when it is on this side of the dimension, and also when the stimulus is somewhere in the middle range. So that's what we would call an operant level, what's there before reinforcement is put into play. Then let's say we decide on what is going to be the descriptive operant class, which is the class of responses upon which reinforcement is contingent. So the experimenter or the practitioner defines the descriptive operant, sets the limit to the left and the right here along the stimulus dimension for what is going to be reinforced. So we are going to reinforce the response only when the stimulus lies between these two outer limits. This could be lights arranged in a row from left to right. So in this case, we would reinforce a response only when one of these three lights are lit between here. And in the presence of the lights outside that range, we'll just extinguish the responding. So the red area here defines the descriptive operant class. And as the procedure runs, we'll see that we get more and more responses in the presence of those stimuli and less outside the ranges of the descriptive class. So we are getting a functional class here, so that the correspondence between the functional class and the descriptive class gets closer and closer. That's necessary to call this operant at all, and it defines an operant class. What's outside here will be considered an example of stimulus generalization. I think we can think of an exemplar as lying between two outer limits where there is little or no responding, so that this would define one exemplar. If we have another top here, that would define another exemplar. So the exemplar goes just as long as the generalization occurs. And now, just to describe imitation as one interesting example to illustrate this. We sometimes think of imitation as one big class. You establish multiple exemplars of imitation skills, and that's the golden path to generalized imitation, as some people have called it. Now, there are experiments by Claire Paulson and some of her colleagues at what's the name of that place outside of New York? Queens College, where they showed that when they established gross motor skills, they could get generalized performances across different gross motor imitation. So you start teaching, do this until the child does this every time, and you move to do this, and you repeat this until the child does this all the time. It will clap on the first few occurrences, of course, because that's trained before. And then you do this until this occurs consistently. Then you mix these two until the mix works consistently, so that the child does what the trainer has modeled. If you then next try to demonstrate a response with an object that involves an object, say do this, it will not easily occur at all. In most examples, this seems to be a different class from the start, so that you have to train that as a separate imitation class, motor behavior that includes objects. And then when you have taught both gross motor skills and behavior that involves motor objects, you start working on vocal imitation, and it usually will not work. So that's a third class, a third basic operant class usually, that has to be taught specifically. And then you get generalization within each of those three classes, but not across them immediately. On the other hand, when both or when all three of them have been successfully established, you can start getting generalization across those three classes. And that's why this is one of the things that Charlie Catania talked about as a higher order class of responses, so that sometimes when you only reinforce gross motor imitation, you will also maintain imitations that involve objects. Excuse me, and also vocal imitation, so that reinforcing only members of the subclasses will maintain the whole range of different imitation classes, and that's what some people, then including Charlie Catania, has been talking about as a higher order operant class that consists of several subclasses that have to be established separately. Once they are all established, the whole thing may start working as a higher order class, that so that instances of those different subclasses will vary together as a function of different operations such as reinforcement and extinction. So I think Dr. Hannon actually had a few good examples of the higher order classes earlier today. So we're going to add those to the list. Okay. There are a few studies that have been directly concerned with the issue of whether what is needed to get those generalized performances is to add a high number of different exemplars, or is it more important to check the details and make sure that the examples that you choose actually sample the variety or variability in the different subclasses that need to be taught. And what seems very clear is that it's not just a question of adding a high number of exemplars. What is needed to get generalized performances is that you sample those different types of stimuli that are supposed to go into and constitute the whole class of phenomena. I'll skip that for now and go to the issue of limits. Limits to what can be obtained through direct multiple exemplar training. There are sometimes no dimensions that permit generalization at all, which is very obvious. I think when we consider such as learning to pronounce the different letters of the alphabet, there's very little to be obtained or generalized from a few exemplars to the whole alphabet. You have to teach all of them separately, all of the different letters, sounds, even different combinations of sounds. And in some languages, those different combinations of sounds are dependent on the context and so on. So it adds up to a fairly high number of different things that really have to be taught directly, and there's no generalization from having learned to say A under the control of an A to learning to say B under control of the B. Nothing at all. You have to teach every single letter sound separately, and more than that. It's pretty obvious.
And it does have an arbitrary stimulus, right?
Yeah, that's good. So all exemplars must be directly trained. There are other examples in which the so-called relational cases in which the relation is so complex that there is really no way to obtain generalized performances just out of adding new exemplars. Let's say, for example, when we learn to multiply in school, you can learn to multiply 25 times 25, and then the next question is, what is 35 times 35? Next question is, what is 65 times 65? And you don't really get much help from those first exemplars in how quickly you learn those next exemplars directly. There's very little gain from direct exemplar training in those cases. And that's why they don't do that in school, of course, at all. What we learn to do in school when we learn to multiply is a way of doing it. We learn some kind of problem-solving activity, a way to solve those kinds of problems. And I'll get back to a couple of examples of that. A third type of situation that needs more than only direct multiple exemplar training, I think, is the training that seems to produce a phenomenon called naming that Loenkron originally taught us about. Many other people, including Doug Greer and others, have done work on establishing what they call naming skills later on. That's a different kind of multiple exemplar training that is needed than just the standard regular multiple exemplar training. We'll skip a couple of slides here again and go to the case of continuous repertoires to show why sometimes multiple exemplar training is or direct multiple exemplar training just can't work very well. There was a few studies on what was called the continuous repertoires in JAB and a few other places in the early 70s. All of that was suggested by a couple of things from Skinner's Science and Human Behavior, where he talked about something he called continuous fields, sort of natural fields where a change along some stimulus dimension changes what kind of response dimensions that are necessary to produce a reinforcer. So they did some experiments with pigeons, having a stimuli along one dimension and responses occurring along some other dimension. It could be the pitch of the sound or stimulus, or just to make it simpler, I have this example. Noise. So in the presence of that stimuli, when the teacher points to that position, the child is supposed to point to that position, and that is being reinforced. We've put in a new stimulus here. So when the teacher points to that position, the child is supposed to point to a corresponding position on the response dimension. And the question then is, what happens when we present a new stimulus? So we do this test and present this stimulus. The question is, what will the child do? What will the pigeon do? What do different animals do under those circumstances? And it was found at that time that children, very young children, would point to that one, as most of us would suspect, whereas the animals usually did one of the two things that had been directly reinforced before. So the pigeons would either take here, which had been reinforced in the presence of that stimulus, or here, which had been reinforced in the presence of that stimulus. And that's about what came out of that research. And unfortunately, Holland, Jim Holland, and some of his students were doing some of this, and I think it should continue. So we did one of these experiments with rats in our own rat lab. This is really important because we can't teach everything. Multiple exemplar training is extremely important. It's useful. Sorry. And for example, in joint attention phenomena, when we point to objects, teach a child to look in the direction that we point, you can't we can't teach everything, every possible direction. We have to be able to pick a few exemplars and hopefully as few as possible that will just generalize across the whole field. So at some point, you'll be able to have the whole range without having taught every possible small specific thing. Is there a chance that we can get the sound back on for this? Something? Is there a loop for? No.
Then you can play the no sound. Is that the approach?
Can we use the sound from the computer directly if we just turn it up? Yeah.
No.
Oh yeah, okay. Okay, so if we take that away, would that
No, it's the same problem.
no sound at all?
Okay, now it seems that it's working. Well, now it's working.
Okay.
You want me to play the video?
Yes. Okay, those are the bricks in the wall that I'm playing. I'll get out of this. Okay. Well, that was to keep you awake and for presentation purposes. Actually, these rats participated in an experiment on continuous repertoires, and we got those performances after having trained pressing the left lever in the presence of the. Yeah, we can do without the sound. So. when we presented a new stimulus, they would go straight to that lever and press. So we could just introduce new stimuli and they would start pressing the lever corresponding to that. Yes?
In that case, you'll be introducing not the new stimulus, but the new sequence, which is different. So the rat has been trained in pressing the lever under each one of the lights. So that's been a training already. The sequence is what you are varying there.
Yeah, well, the question is whether the training will generalize to other instances along those two dimensions. And I guess we can always say that when performance occurs, it has been trained somehow, or at least the prerequisites have been trained. What exactly constitutes a different stimulus here? Excuse me, it's a complex matter. It looks in many of these experiments with animals, it looks as if what we would otherwise call the same stimulus, if it's presented in a new position, it works like a totally new stimulus, which may be one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get to demonstrate stimulus equivalence in animals. I don't know, but certainly just a change in the position of a stimulus on a monitor for chimps, for example, can make performances break down. So there's a lot of training to be done before stimulus is responded to as the same stimulus if you move it to somewhere else. And actually, what happened in some of those previous experiments with pigeons, where that whole performance broke down, when you presented a stimulus on the intermediate values of some dimension, so it was clearly responded to or not responded to as a new stimulus. So I think it's interesting that we actually got that kind of performance here. It's possible that what those rats learned was to approach the light and just press the lever that was closest to that light. But that would be a kind of mediating behavior, actually, which I think is much more obviously important when the dimensions or the relation between those dimensions get more complex. So what would happen here with animals and children if we rotate those dimensions? So we have the stimulus dimension vertically and the response dimension horizontally. We could do the same kind of experiment. But in this case, it would be easier for us with some kind of equipment to get from here to the corresponding stimulus there. We could do so by counting. Number 1, 2, 3. Well, we press number 3. So we have this repertoire of skills that will help us get from the stimulus dimension to the correct position on the response dimension. And those are clearly behaviors. There are what Skinner and others talked about as pre-current behaviors. That is part of the problem-solving repertoire. And I can't see how such performances would be possible at all without a repertoire of that kind of problem-solving skills or public mediating behavior. But it's behavior, it's not some other mediating stuff. It's clearly behavior that has to be established as such. And Stokes and Bear in a paper established after Don Bear and passed away, unfortunately. They wrote that some problem classes require mediation for generalized correct solutions, and that's exactly what I think they is is true here. David Palmer has come up with a few very good examples, I think, of these kinds of performances. One example is when you ask people, what is the 10th letter after F in the alphabet? It's there are hardly people who can answer that directly without doing something first to get to the answer. And of course, what we do is to count as we go through the alphabet, F, G, and so on. And that leads us to the correct solution to that problem. So P is then the 10th letter after F. We can move on with what's the 10th letter after C, what's the 10th letter after I, what's the 10th letter after M. And this wouldn't work very well as a multiple exemplar training directly, but it might work as a multiple exemplar training in the strategy to solve that kind of problems. So it would not work directly as a multiple exemplar training of getting the 10th letter, but it would teach us very well how to do it through multiple exemplars. Now another type of example which is difficult to get to directly through multiple exemplar training is when there's a relation between the discriminative stimulus and the response is very complex. So how many dots did you see here?
No.
There? It's fairly simple. How many did you see there? Second one? Well, it's getting more difficult in any case. And then those stimuli are not arranged in a certain pattern that is familiar to us. It's almost impossible when we get to this type of complexity. We have to have repetition, so we have to be able to do something in order to get there to the result. This is much easier, of course, because here we have a pattern that we can tact directly, but we don't have a proper tact for the complex thing. And in this case too, with a mathematical problem, the relation directly between the SD and the response is too complex. There's no way we can get there directly, but we can learn to do this fairly easily by learning a special strategy. So that if you take the first number here, the 10 number, which is 6 in this case, all numbers that end on 5 and are to be squared, you can take that number and multiply it with 1 higher. So this would be 6 times 7, which is 1 more than 6. You put that here, 42, and then just 25 at the end. So what is 85 times 85? 85 squared. That would be 8 times 9, which is 72. So 7,025. To do it. So well, we could move on. One more. What's 35 times 35? 35. Simple and quick. 7 times 8, 56, 25. What's 55 times 55? 3025. So this is a kind of a party trick that you can use, and if anybody asks you how you did that, you just say that's the way I am. I'm quite good generally, and because if you reveal the sources of your behavior, you will be robbed of all the credit, of course. But on the other hand, if you are honest, you will have to report doing something similar to what we have been talking about here, even when you do it overtly. And there's no question that some of these skills can occur without being visible to others, and they clearly have the same kind of function in those cases as well. So there are many different types of cases of that require multiple exemplar training, obviously. But I think in each case we should go through a list like this, try to specify exactly what constitutes an exemplar, what constitutes a non-exemplar. Are there specific non-exemplars needed, or are they embedded in the basic task assignment? What's the reinforcement criterion? What's the exemplar training criterion? What's the mixed training criterion before you move on to the next? What's the final criterion? There are many of these different types of cases that require multiple exemplar training, have to end up with some kind of novel exemplars, such as imitation training. There's no use going through a lot of imitation training if you don't get to the point where you can get the child to imitate novel responses. That's the whole point. Otherwise, your training is just an harassment, adding to all that other stuff. So the success is to get where you can model novel responses and get the child to do them. Then you really have a helpful skill that can be used to train almost every performance in the world. And I think we should ask one last question. When is direct multiple exemplar training not enough? When is that not sufficient? When, for example, is some kind of problem-solving skill necessary in order to get those generalized performances? I think we should ask those questions for each of those different types of skills that obviously require multiple exemplar training, such as training children to respond to specific relations, identity matching, rule following, responding to lag schedules, answering why questions, and other types of WH questions, describing past events, different things called learning sets, and continuous repertoires. And that's it for now. Thank you for listening. I do not know if there is time for specific questions.
It's time for one question. Or eager to have a shower. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Bueno,